Cool. And then she just let you know. Okay. And so, hi, my name is Nikki Atkins. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of North Carolina. And I want to welcome you to Lily Mae Francis Foundation's monthly mental health wellness meeting. Today's topic is grief. Before we get started, I do have a little housekeeping. I want to make sure everyone is aware that this group session is intended to provide information and support related to mental health wellness. Any information or advice offered during this session is not considered a professional or clinical diagnosis. If you need professional or clinical support, please be sure to reach out to your primary care provider or other mental health resources in your area. Because some people are joining us for the first time, I'm going to go over our ground rules. Because we intend for this to be a safe space for everyone to process and vent and share, we ask that you be respectful of each other, try not to interrupt each other, and always be aware that everyone's opinion matters. Okay. Any questions before we get started?
No.
Okay, so today we have, excuse me, a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You guys let me know when you can see. Can everyone see that?
We can see.
Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to stop me. I can't see you guys. I can't see you raise your hand. So if you have a question, while I'm presenting, I encourage you to stop me and ask so that we can discuss whatever you want to discuss at that moment. Okay, so when we're talking about grief, we're talking about, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought someone said something. When we're talking about grief, we're talking about a normal and natural response to loss. I have a little video where I feel that she can explain a little bit better than I can. So I'm going to share that, this professional.
Grief is a set of experiences that involves the perceived loss that someone has around a person, a situation, a event, a happening that changes the way that they physically, emotionally, spiritually react and respond to the world around them. So if we're thinking about the way that we're taught that grief is, we're taught that it just involves a death event, a death of a loved one. But grief actually encompasses a series of losses and a series of change, and has to do with how we integrate that change into our day-to-day functioning.
I thought that was an excellent description of what encompasses grief. It's important to understand, if we're going to add on to what she just shared, that every person's grief experience is unique and each loss is unique. So you may experience grief in a different way depending on the connection you have with the person that has passed. Factors that can impact our individual grief journey include the relationship we have with the person, the way that they passed, our personality or coping style, and our past experiences with loss, and our religious or spiritual beliefs and customs. Any questions so far? Anything anyone wants to add? Okay. These are some common emotions that are associated with the grief process: sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, frustration, numbness, relief, fear, resentment, envy. I'm sorry, relief is there twice: hope, gratitude, longing or yearning, disbelief, shame, hopelessness, and emptiness. A couple of those sound, I guess I would say common or regular, but there may be a couple that stood out to me, at least, that I had to reflect upon. For example, the gratitude one. And with further reflection, I feel that the gratitude emotion associated with grief would come from gratitude, could come from being grateful for knowing the person, being grateful for being connected with the person and having them in your life. And the longing and the yearning, to me is feels like, just wishing they were here or wishing you had more time, or, the common wishing I could dance with my father one more time or talk to my mom again. So these are some of the common and maybe not often thought about emotions that are related to grief.
Nikki,
Uh-huh.
I also think that these emotions they can be coexisting, right? So we have that gratitude or that relief. It could be accompanied with guilt. Because I am relieved, right? This was a hard job. Think of our caretakers, this being a hard job, but now feeling guilty because this loved one is gone. And I'm kind of rejoicing or feeling relief. And so I think sometimes these emotions can coexist.
I agree 100%. Thank you for bringing that up. That is indeed true. In general, just in humanness, we can feel emotions, more than one emotion at a time. We can feel conflicting emotions that seem to like go against one another. So I definitely thank you for that, Atia. We can definitely have any combination of these emotions at the same time and at different times throughout our grief process. Thank you for sharing that. Some of the physical and mental symptoms of grief include changes in our sleeping patterns, memory problems, digestive issues, headaches, migraines, body aches, low energy, changes in appetite, along our like cognitively, as far as like our mental processing, mental problems, altered perceptions of time. We may begin to experience time loss or lose track. I mean, on any given day, I can lose track of what day it is, but that issue can actually, be more, upfront when you're grieving. Confusion, difficulty processing and understanding information, and forgetfulness are some of the physical and mental symptoms of grief. There are different types of grief. So normal grief, the word normal is used in this space to just kind of relate to the understanding that when we have a loss, we're going to feel sadness, and it's going to, and any other number of emotions, and this is common and expected. So that's what makes it normal grief. It's normal because normally when we lose someone we care about, we grieve their passing. Another type of grief is traumatic grief, which is a normal grief response that is experienced in combination with a trauma response as a result of the loved one being lost in a way that is violent and unexpected and or frightening. Anticipatory grief is feelings of grief or loss that are felt before the loss actually happens. So if we find out that we or someone we love has a terminal illness, so we know, and they're given a certain amount of time to live. And so we know that, very shortly, we're going to experience that loss, and our mind and our body can begin to start the grieving process, often do begin to start the grieving process even before the loss has occurred. Ambiguous grief is an unresolved grief, a grief or lack of closure related to an experienced loss. Some examples of that would be someone who has gone to jail, been given a life sentence for jail. So the chances are that you'll never get to see them in person again. Those type of disconnections, we can most definitely grieve, and will go through the exact same grief process as someone who has actually, passed away. Military deployment, sometimes divorce can even bring about this ambiguous grief. And if we think about things like kidnappings, like if someone doesn't know where their loved one is, or runaways, and so they've never really had any closure. Are they alive? Are they dead? Those kind of things where there's no closure, there's no answers, are what we classify as ambiguous grief. Delayed grief is a grief response that is, I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay. So delayed grief is a grief response that we experience long after the death of a loved one. Now, long, can be anywhere from months to years. But we did not see any significant grief response at the time of the loss, but then sometime later that person starts to experience grief. There's a couple of reasons why this might occur. One, it could be the person's coping mechanism. They could be so successful in the denial portion of grief, or pushing down the emotions of grief, that they don't enter into the grief process or the stages of the grief process until a later point, which may be something that triggers that grief response later on down the line. This delayed grief can also be seen in young children. So when they experience a loss at a young age, it may be something that they're not fully comprehending the finality of it, understanding exactly what that means. And then as they grow, they understand and recognize the loss, and then start to grieve at that point, at that time. Um, or a person could have too many things, like functionally going on in their life, and you've heard people say, I haven't really had time to grieve the loss of so and so. They could have a small child. They could be in the middle of a transition, a life transition, and so may not have had the time or the mental capacity to grieve at that time. But then when things calm down or quiet down, they will begin to go through that grief response. And then there's
And
collective. I'm sorry. I don't know if
I
I'm
would
echoing
just,
or somebody's saying something.
yeah, I would just say too, from past experience, that one could experience multiple types of grief
Hmm.
at the same time as well.
I agree. Did you have a personal experience, or were you aware of someone's experience?
Yeah, personal experience.
Okay, yeah, most definitely. The same way we can, have different emotions, the grief process and the grief response is definitely not set in stone. It's very fluid and can change. And so you can go through these different types of grief, or you can go through the different ways and symptoms of grieving, throughout that journey. So thank you for sharing that. Collective grief is a grief response experienced by a group of people, a community, a nation, or a particular demographic within a certain time frame. So typically there is an event, and because that event, a collective can relate to, you will see, that collective grieving, for that loss. So some examples I can give you would be, the way that a lot of mothers responded to Trayvon Martin's death, right? You would see the way the nation responded to 9/11, so things like that, where a huge group, or a community feels the loss, whether or not it's related to them directly or not, it can be classified as collective grief. So I thought this quote was very interesting, because it felt very true to me. There are really only two stages of grief: who you are, who you were before, and who you are after. And this is speaking to, leading us into the stages of grief, which most of us have heard, that there are stages of grief, and that we all go through them at some point. But if you break it down, right, it's really who I was before, and who I am after. So if we're talking clinically, the 5 stages of grief are going to be denial, where we, have difficulty accepting, that, the loss has occurred, to the point where we may, not even believe it, refuse to acknowledge that the loss have occurred. So we're denying that we've experienced the loss of that person. That And I wanted to make sure I say that this could go linearly. It could go in order as you're seeing it here, but it doesn't have to. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, in a little bit more, about the way it can flow through these processes. But then we have anger, where we're upset, and we could be angry, with the person that passed. We could be angry, with God. We could be angry with ourselves. We may have thought there's something we could have done, any number of things to be angry or angry at or about. But anger is identified as the second stage. That moves us into bargaining, where, we're asking God if we could have, one more talk with them, or if you do this, or if this happens. And remember, not every grief that I detailed or outlined for you included an actual loss, right? So if someone is grieving, let's see if we're talking about the ambiguous grief, right? And so it could be, I don't know, when my child might come home, but God, if you bring them home, I'll do this, I'll be this kind of person. So the bargaining can take place with the person that is actually deceased, or in situations where the person is separated, so you're grieving that separation from them. Depression is the next stage, where we start feeling all the sadness and the lack of motivation, the desire not to kind of participate in the world, the withdrawal from the world, because I've heard it referred to like a movie, like you're watching a movie, where everyone's watching a movie, but on your screen, the movie turns to a horror movie while everyone else is still watching a romantic comedy. And you're kind of looking around going, don't they see what's happening? This is horrible, but this is only your experience. Like the rest of the world goes on. And so you're still kind of struggling through your personal horror movie. And then that brings on that depression and isolation. And then at some point we experience acceptance, where we reach an understanding, that, we've experienced the loss, and that, that we're working on moving forward. And while we do love and miss the person, that, we're going to be able to continue on with our life. So when I said that, it doesn't necessarily go in order, a lot of people do think it will go in order. So this is the experience that you expect, but this is actually what we get. Those stages, you can go forward and backwards and loop back around, and you can start bargaining and then go back to being angry, and then you can accept it and then have a trigger and be depressed. So the picture on the right is a more accurate, path of how we move through those stages of grief in actual
question.
Uh-huh.
So grief never really goes away, it seems like you're always fighting a stage of some sort. Is that right?
I believe so. I believe that you're always experiencing some level of one of these stages. Time does normally lend to acceptance, and so, as the further away, I guess, or the more time has passed between the loss, it may be easier for us to smile when we think about our loved one as opposed to cry. Like it might occur more often, but at any time, years and years and years after we lost someone that we care about, we can go into any of these stages. And so it really just becomes a matter of, as time goes by, us learning how to cope better and manage and navigate our emotions and our feelings better. And I'm also going to give us a couple of tips a little bit later on to help us with that coping and navigating. Was that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything they would like to share in regards to the stages of grief or their own personal experience? Okay. So this slide goes a little bit more into detail, kind of like layers in between those 5 stages that people typically experience, right? So at the very top, and if you notice at the top over here on the left, we're kind of like our status quo. This is where we were, and then we experienced that loss. And then it kind of goes downhill from there. So we may initially feel some type of, the shock, the numbness, the denial, this is all, I guess, grouped together with the denial phase. We're shocked, we're numb, we can feel foggy, like, again, having problems and difficulty processing information, maybe probably feel like it's not real, like it's like if we're having an out of body experience, like this is happening to someone else. That's all part of that first descent into the grief process, right? That may be followed by or include emotional outbursts. You may find yourself yelling or screaming, cursing people out, cursing God out, cursing the person you lost out. All that is perfectly natural. It goes along with the anger, which also leads to fear. Okay, so now what am I going to do without this person? Who's going to help me with this? Who's going to support me in this way that only this person did? Who's going to be my partner? Who's going to be any number of things that we're trying to find, that lead to us trying to figure out what's next and searching for some type of meaning or understanding or cause or reason that we are experiencing this loss. And within that space, more of the fogginess and maybe disorganization, kind of confusion as far as daily functioning, which could also lead us to a place of panic. So it's like, oh, wait, I don't think I can go on without this person. I don't know what life looks like without this person. So that kind of down slope that you're seeing on that screen is, what we experience, after our loss, and we're moving forward toward the loneliness and the guilt and the isolation. Typically, what's at the bottom of that curve is the time when everything has kind of calmed down, right? So you've had the services, the family's been in, everyone's kind of gone home now. And at this point, there's nothing to really occupy you or preoccupy you, excuse me. And so we kind of despair could set in, where we're feeling the totality of our loss and we're feeling lonely and isolated, and that may involve some type of guilt or resentment. But the bottom of that curve is the part where you're going to typically feel the most despair and feel most alone within your grief. So like we talked about with time, and with coping mechanisms and strategies and supports, the desired outcome is for us to move toward the upswing of our grief journey. And so as we're moving through the depression and trying to utilize our coping strategies and mechanisms and our supports, we may experience some difficulty re-entering the world. So I haven't really been out here. I've been grieving, so I don't know what's really what's hot or what's new in the world. Some of us may have to transition back into our jobs. Some of us may have to transition back into friendships, right? So there are some barriers and some things that we have to experience of kind of coming up out of the bottom of the grief curve and moving back into like our daily functioning. Within that climb, we're going to have some new relationships. We're going to find some new strengths. A lot of times in grief, we do find strengths and things about ourselves that we didn't know that we possess, simply because we were able to survive such a hard life blow, right? And then based on our new life and our new, I guess, the new situation of our life and the changes in our life, there's going to be different patterns or new ways that we function. It's important to have these three things: the new relationships, the new strengths, the new patterns, because that's what's going to get us back out there into the world, right? And so as we're moving up on our upswing, moving toward acceptance, that last stage of grief, that's going to have some hope, some affirmation. Those are things that we can find, within our support systems, within our new patterns. A big part of that would be, helping others, sharing our experiences, sharing our stories, to help us complete, not necessarily complete, but to, achieve acceptance. Like I said, where we get to a point where we can, it's easier for us to smile when we think about our loved one, than crying. Any questions about this?
What would So I know I have a tendency to like throw myself into work or doing other things whenever I experienced loss in the past.
Mhm.
What would that fall under? Or is that a part of
I didn't hear the last part. You said, is that a part of?
like any of the stages?
I would say that it's a part of the reentry. I just would say that you would have to be careful to make sure that you did not replace this moment right here at the bottom where, it's kind of you by yourself when you're reflecting on your feelings. Because there's a danger of being stuck in like denial or repressed. So, if you don't actually give yourself, and I'm going to get into that, that's actually one of the coping mechanisms of giving yourself permission to grieve or to feel sad or to feel horrible or to feel like I can't function right now. And instead of giving yourself that permission, you try to kind of like push through it and don't engage in, fully engage in the grieving process and allow your emotions to run their course. Then, the best way I can describe it is the fall is going to be an even harder fall. Does that
And
make sense?
yes.
So it's important for us to allow ourselves the grief process. Otherwise, we run the risk of increasing or experiencing sustained depression or persistent depression or any other of mental health concerns that could come about not expressing and reflecting upon our emotions. Any other questions?
I just want to say that from personal experience, I think that that was the hardest part for me, to allow myself to grieve, because it's kind of just like, I don't have time to fall apart. I can't,
Mhm.
I need to be able to, because I guess the fear is, if I allow myself to fall apart, how long is this fall going to be?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
I have other things that I have to be responsible for. So it's hard to just allow it to start, because you can't, you don't feel like you control when it stops.
Mhm. And you're right, because there is no timeline, right? And there can be times in the grief process where, even though you want to, figuratively or literally fall down, right? You may not be able to. Let's say that that there's a small child involved, and so they got to eat. They have to be taken care of. So at this moment I can't. But I think what I want us to be careful of is that we're not making that the pattern. We're not making every time our emotions arise or come to the surface regarding our grief or our loss, we're intentionally pushing them away. So maybe not right now while I got to take care of the baby, but when the baby goes to bed and I start having these emotions, I need to sit in that moment or practice or, sitting in that moment. I need to make an appointment with, a mental health provider or a grief counselor so that I can set aside a time where I can process and grieve and talk about these emotions. And so even if you are caught up in things that you have to do as far as for survival, right, you still have to make sure you take time to process that grief and to feel your and express your emotions. Thank you for sharing that, because I'm sure a lot of people, that's their same mind frame. It's like, I don't have time to fall apart right now. But it's necessary. We have to find time to feel and process and express how we feel. Otherwise, it manifests itself in other mental health and physical health ways.
And I would say too that there's not really a timeline that we can put on it, because I personally have experienced, say, when I lost my mother in 2009, it took me probably 5 years to be able to even talk about her without crying.
Mm-hmm.
And then since then, there are periods, like certain triggers, like her birthday or Mother's Day. Some years I'm good. Other years I could just be sitting there and all of a sudden just fall apart.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty common. It's like, you know, I don't know if you ever heard anyone refer to grief as like waves of grief. It really is like, it's like like an ocean. So sometimes the waves are, you know, really high, and then other times it's like a little ripple, and then you never know, you know, like when the tide is going to come in. And so, you know, what you just described is exact, you know, is common and normal for the way grief can come in and out, you know, with frequency and intensity. And maybe,
And
you know, I'm
I
sorry, go
can
ahead.
and I can remember when my grandmother passed, it was, and I still look at it and try to analyze it, which just still doesn't make sense to me. And I think maybe it shouldn't make sense to me. But it was like when I got in the house and my mother was sitting at the table, I couldn't go to her. Like I couldn't go to her. It was like I couldn't touch her. I couldn't hug her because it was like I was experiencing my own loss and I didn't have the capacity I felt like to help her with her loss of her mother because
Mhm.
I was experiencing my own loss of my grandmother.
Yeah, very human
Mm.
and okay. Like you know, I hope you don't have any guilt associated with that moment, because
I
everyone
did for
experiences
a
that
long
grief.
time, but I finally got over it.
Yeah, I would encourage you to work toward releasing that, because you know it's human, and sometimes we don't have the capacity. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, and it's okay when we don't. We just don't want to get in. We don't want to get stuck in a space of where we can't function or we can't move forward, as because we're not allowing ourselves the time or the permission to process.
I have a question about like experiencing grief from a personal standpoint, I guess. I don't know if that's the word, but would you say that people can experience these same stages of grief for things within themselves, like when they transition from being a child or a young adult to being an adult, or if you're like a child and you're going through like a loss of innocence or like a loss of your childhood for children who grow up living in like traumatic experiences, like they were abused or they had to like work from an early age to provide for their family and things like that. Do you say that they would experience, like, you can see those kinds of losses of grief or the stages of grief experience in that way as well?
Most definitely. You can experience grief related to any loss. And remember, I told you it doesn't have to be the actual loss of a living person, right? So you can definitely grieve your childhood. You can definitely grieve, the loss of relationships that you never had. You can definitely grieve opportunities that you didn't have. You could grieve, the loss of a house. Let's say you had a family home, that's been in your home in your family for generations, and then you guys lost the home. Then that could be an example of collective grief, where the whole family could mourn this family, this place where the family used to meet, and they have so many memories and so many connections, and now that childhood home is gone, or that family home is gone. You can most definitely grieve those things. And within those spaces, you can go through the same, stages of bargaining and anger and depression or sadness, and then at some point, hopefully acceptance. And with that acceptance could come, okay, what's new, being hopeful for the future, what's next in my life, kind of along the same line of things that we can of hopefulness that we can look forward to when we're experiencing the loss of a person or a loved one.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have anything they want to share, or any other questions? Okay. So here we are at what can I do? Loss is such a profound feeling, and it always makes us feel like at the end of our rope, or like that's the end. Um, but there are strategies that can help us to cope and navigate our grief journey. The first one, and I think the most important one, we've already touched on, about giving yourself permission to feel how you're feeling, giving yourself permission to grieve, giving yourself permission to be sad and to cry and to be angry and all of those things. Um, you know, not only do you have the right to those things, they're necessary. You need to be able to express or process or feel whatever you're feeling, um, in order for you to be able to move forward to the next stages. And not giving yourself permission to express or to feel or process is setting you up for high risk of mental health concerns and physical health concerns. Remember and honor your loved ones. That could be done in any number of ways. Some people have rituals, where they celebrate the birthdays of their loved ones. They release balloons. Some people have ancestor altars where they, place pictures up of their family, and pray to them. Some people talk to their loved ones. Some people write letters to their loved ones, but I'm sorry, excuse me. We found it's more helpful, even though different people have different ways of processing and coping. It appears to be more helpful to people when they talk about them and engage in remembering them actively, than not. Not talking about our loved ones. I mean, because I've experienced clients or people, or individuals who they won't even say the name of the person who they lost, and they don't like when anyone else says the name of the person they lost. And that might be helpful for them, but we found clinically that it for most people it appears to be more helpful if you do talk about them, if you share stories, if you memorialize them in some way, because it bridges the connection. Self-care is very important. So make sure that you're taking time for yourself. And this self-care can be as small as taking a shower and getting your hair done and getting your nails done, or getting outside and exercising, or, engaging in some, interest or hobbies that make you feel good or make you feel peaceful or make you feel connected with other people. But whatever the case is, that self-care needs to be a priority for you. You need to schedule that self-care like you do any other task. And you need to make sure that you're engaging in things that bring you peace and make you feel good, because that also supports you in that space of sadness and depression, because we're trying to minimize the long-term risk that we run from, of depression and sadness and anxiety and any number of mental health concerns that can accompany a loss. Set boundaries for yourself. You don't have to go to every, family function. You don't have to go to every balloon release if you don't want to, right? And so you can set boundaries. You don't have to answer every phone call, right? So be sure to say, we may feel like we're obligated to engage on a particular level with people. But it's within your right to set that limit and establish that boundary. And like I've spoken before in the past in regards to boundaries, it's not your responsibility, or you cannot be concerned, I guess I should say, with how people respond to your boundaries. The boundaries are in place for you, not for them. And so, you know, I wouldn't spend a lot of time worried about, am I offending them because I didn't answer the phone? How are they going to feel about me not showing up? In this space of you dealing with your loss on your grief journey, you kind of got to, make yourself the priority, your self-care, the priority, and boundaries are necessary in that space.
I think it's also important to note that, especially if there's a loss in like a family, some family members don't grieve in healthy ways. And when you're trying to process that grief, and then you run into theirs and the way that they choose to handle it, it can kind of be regressive. And so I found for me specifically that boundaries about what I will talk about, what I won't talk about, how I'll be talked to when it comes to losses in the family has been very important, because some of it's just unhealthy.
Thank you for that. I agree 100%. An example I would use is that if there was a traumatic loss, some people, part of their grieving process would be to talk about the tragedy and talk about, all the trauma associated to the loss, where another person feels like, that's not the part I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to rehash that. I don't want to talk about how we're going to figure out what happened and who did it. I just want to, grieve and kind of focus on the person that I love that I've lost. So that would be an excellent place for a boundary, because you're right, people do grieve in different ways. And if the way that someone around you is triggering you or, causing you more distress, then a boundary is definitely needed. Thank you for that. So another good coping mechanism or strategy is to volunteer help with others. We always feel better when we're helping others. It's an excellent way for us to give back and to take our mind off of our loss, is to provide something that other people may need, be it support or companionship or, life essentials. Helping others releases feel-good chemicals in our own brain, and that helps us to deal with our depression symptoms. Limit social media. Social media, this should be something that I would encourage for people, regardless of any loss they experience, but definitely during times of loss or emotional struggle. You should really reflect on your limit or putting limits or boundaries upon your social media, just because there's just so much input and so much to process, such the potential for triggers and comparisons, and it can get to a point where it wouldn't be healthy. I think this is a good strategy that people might not think about, but limiting social media during times of loss can be very effective. And then engage with the community and natural supports. Community supports are going to be things like organizations. This meeting that we're in right now is a community support, your church. And then your natural supports are your family and friends, your circle of people, that lift you up and, and cover and protect you. This is a good time for you to lean into those people and into those organizations to help you, as you go through these different stages. All right, guys, that's all I had. I would love for anyone to share or talk, or any feedback would be wonderful. I think people underestimate the value of their stories to other people.
As it so happens, I attended a funeral last night. One of our Orange and Blue people, Nikki, Kevin. I don't know if you remember Kev, but Kevin's mom passed away last night, and so not last night. The funeral was last night, so I saw it at the last minute. I got off work, rushed over, showed up. Of course, there was a few more people there that I expected to be there. They were there. He took it pretty hard, but he was happy to see us. So, on just being able to be there for somebody, that also meant a lot. there was a slight incident, not really an incident at all, but it just was a thing that has no place in it, which kind of speaks to what Diamond was saying, you know, watch out for those who have different negative opinions. As a few more people showed up, one of the people in the group was saying, oh, I don't really mess with him like that. And it's an old college beef. And it's like, dude, you need to let that go. And plus, today ain't the day. So, you know, you do need to be mindful of the people that you're around. And if you're coming to support someone, stay focused on supporting that person and not the other things that's going on around in the room.
Definitely. Thank you for that input, Kier. It reminds me of the diagram that I showed, where at the bottom, when I said like at your loneliest, at your most depressed state following the loss, is typically your most isolated state, because you know the funeral is over and everybody's gone home. If you are trying to support someone who is at that stage, that is the perfect time for you to reach out, because people typically are kind of like, when they have a loss, it's kind of like, you all right? You know, you good? Okay, we got that. You know, here's some food and da da da. And then everybody, you know, has to go back to their lives. And so it's kind of like, at that point, it's really, really quiet and you're really, really alone. And that's when you need someone the most. So if you're thinking about supporting someone and they're in that stage where the funeral is over and the people, you know, the crowd has kind of died down, that would be the perfect time to reach out to them.
I really enjoyed the stages of grief and like the chart. It was like the valley. And I would be more interested in kind of learning what teachers can do specifically to help adapt those coping mechanisms to a classroom environment in appropriate ways, because I may be able to recognize that a child is going through it, like if they lose somebody in their family, or in certain communities, if their family members go to jail, or if they're no longer the younger child, different things like that. And I can recognize that they're processing it, especially at the younger ages, but having strategies to where we can use those coping mechanisms that you show, but like with practical tips or activities for classrooms, that would be helpful, because I feel like there's a need for that, especially in communities where emotional processing is a skill that could be worked on more.
Diamond, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because it didn't even occur to me till you just said it, but I lost my mom when I was 6, and nobody that I can remember at school said anything. And then it wasn't until like Mother's Day would come up and the class would be making cards for their mothers. And then I would be sitting there looking like, okay, now what am I supposed to be doing right now? And then, you know, the class would go on, and then I would call the teacher over and say, so what would you suggest that I do? And then it would be like, oh my God, you know, and a whole bunch of dramatics of, I'm so sorry, I forgot. And then I don't remember though what the answer was for that. You know, I don't remember who I made a card for. Maybe my great aunt, possibly. But I just remembered, I mean, now that Diamond said that, if there was no counseling or conversations, and not just from school, from anybody. My dad was in such a state of grief that we just never talked about her. And just never talked about it. And I think I started off asking questions, and then I saw that it was making him sadder. So I just stopped asking questions. So I think that is definitely important for schools to get involved in, or somebody at the very least, or, teaching families how to manage it, because nobody said anything to me.
Yeah, it's definitely a something that I guess skills and strategies that need to be transferred over to school with children, because that's the way they spend the majority of their day, you know, regardless of what's happening at the house. They're still got to go to school, and like you said, Lynn, and then experience other people, you know, talking about their family makeup and not being able to be included in that family makeup. I think that based on what Diamond said, I would lead with, as a teacher, um, one, your connection with that child's family. So I'm sure that hopefully, um, you know, the family reach out to the teacher and let them know that their child has experienced this loss, so the teacher's aware. So then I would say, as a teacher, you would make sure you just kind of monitor that child for any type of behaviors. A lot of times we, you know, anger or aggression are our bodyguards to sadness. So if you see, you know, the child that has lost someone acting out in any kind of way, you know, have a little grace in that space, you know, and they, you know, talk to them one-on-one, give them time to process and talk about what they may be experiencing, offer them some, you know, art therapy is good. So maybe they want to draw about how they're feeling. You know, when you see that they might having some maladaptive behaviors. And then as the teacher or the educator, I would also reach out to the school counselor, because the parents may not have thought to reach out to the counselor. They might have just told the teacher. So as the educator, I would go to the counselor and let them know that the child is experiencing this, you know, and then see if they can arrange, you know, with the parents some time for them to spend with the counselor. You had mentioned, particularly, and it stood out to me when you said particularly in communities where there might not be a lot of emotional processing. And so we're talking about communities typically that don't have access or knowledge of tools for effective communication and expression. And that's going to be, you know, economically challenged neighborhoods. That's going to be neighborhoods with lower education rates, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have a race associated with it, but you know, where there's just the socioeconomic status is on the low end. You're going to have not a lot of mental health awareness. You're going to have a lot of difficulty with communicating, and unfortunately, you're going to have a lot of trauma, because those things kind of all go together. And so it, you know, it's be very beneficial for, you know, teachers to be aware of what's going on in their students' families, and then kind of stand in the gap to connect those families with resources, and then to kind of help support the child who may be acting out in different ways in response to their loss. I hope that helps.
Yes.
Anyone else have anything they would like to share? Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming out today and joining us and participating. We really do appreciate you guys, and hopefully that you guys are benefiting from this service and from our talks.
I have definitely
Absolutely. Thank you.
been a beneficial receiver of these chats. So I am 1,000% appreciative of the existence of this group. And I want to say thank you for existing and inviting me in.
You're very welcome. And we plan to be doing this for a long time. So keep showing up and tell a friend. They can also visit us on lmfoutreach.org is our website. You can check there for updates, other videos that give us some little insights or tips or strategies for mental health wellness, as well as our YouTube channel. And you can find all of the information in the chat momentarily.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So I'm going to turn this over to Lynn for our affirmations.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't think, we don't normally do affirmations on the monthly, right?
Oh, I apologize. I thought we did. Okay. So that means we're done. You guys can go on with your Saturdays. Remember, our next
Thank-
meeting will be on Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Our weekly meeting will be next Wednesday at 6 o'clock
Eastern.
Eastern time. Yep.
Thank you to
Thank you.
Lily Mae Francis and the staff. Thank you.
Thank
Everybody
you.
be safe. Take care. Have an amazing weekend.
You
You
too.
as well.
All right. Be
Okay.
safe.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, y'all go ahead and disconnect. I'm just driving. I'm gonna just see it all go.